Hello there, my witchy nibblings. Just in case you're wondering, nibbling is a gender inclusive term that means your sibling's child. So, niece, nephew, nibbling. I'm your witchy auntie. You're my witchy nibbling. But I mean, nibbling also kind of sounds like a delicate little tasty treat, which makes me feel like, yes, I'm your witchy aunt, but I live in a gingerbread house and have child-sized ovens. I kind of like both of those interpretations of the word, so feel free to interpret that however works best for you. Okay, so one of the huge perks of leaving social media that I've experienced since last April is the fact that I have just a lot more free time for reading. And y'all, that's so good for my soul. I'm a former literature teacher. Um, I'm just like a giant book nerd. I love fiction, nonfiction, poetry, plays, travel blogs, recipes, Google reviews. Like, I am a reader, right? And I'm very, very excited to have plans for lots of book reviews in 2025 because I'm reading a lot of books. And I think a lot of them would be relevant to your interests as they are to mine. So, yay, I heart books. Here we go. I've actually recently read two books by George Hares, aka The North English Witch, that I would like to share with you today. And these books are The Ineffable Name, A Crafter's Guide to Traditional Witchcraft, which was published in 2022, and Barbarous Words, A Compendium of Conjurations, British Folk Magic, and Other Popish Charms, which was published in 2023. I'm going to review them both in this video. Um, Again, hooray! It's a twofer. Twofer is short for the phrase two for one, which I point out in case that you think that I've just been living in Kentucky too long and that I'm somehow referring to my teeth, which would either be tooth, singular, or teethies for plural. Okay, so I'm going to start by saying about both books. I'm going to cover both books for a little bit together, and then I'm going to dive into one book and then the other. So I'm going to start off by saying that I have enjoyed both of these books, and they are both really great additions to the library of, I think, any witch, but most especially for the libraries of trad crafters and folkloric type witches, people that are interested in folk magic. They're written conversationally, both of these books. They're based on real practice, George's practice, not just based on theory or fluff. Um, and they're both compassionately validating of like whatever you practice, whatever your practice looks like. Um, George writes in a way that is accepting of what you do while offering valuable insight into his own practice. And I really love all of that. Those are all things that I aim for in my own books as well. So I really like seeing that come across in other writers' writing. And I'm going to dig into specifics here in just a minute of what's so good in all of the books. And by way of criticism or constructive feedback, I really only have one comment. So for this, we're moving to the indie publisher, Cam. Welcome to the library. Ooh, I gotta take those off. I can't see anything right now. So I don't want to say this in a harsh way because I really enjoyed the content of the books, but both of these books would really benefit from a proofreader to catch some of the mechanical errors that are really common among all writers, whether they're indie published, like I am, like George's books are, or traditionally published. You know, a traditionally published author, their work's going to get seen by lots of eyes before it ever makes it to the shelf or to the, you know, to the online checkout that you're getting it from. which means that a lot of people have had a chance to go through and correct those kinds of proofreading errors, to just sort of check for flow and grammar, make sure things look nice on the page. And they just sort of smooth out a lot of the things that I think a reader doesn't necessarily realize might be impacting the readability of a text, but can. Things like font, margins, pagination. Like, one of the really common errors that I see in a whole lot of indie published books is every page has the page number in the lower right hand corner, even if it's a left hand side of the page, which means that that page number is now in the gutter, right? Which is the seam in the middle of the book where the pages come together. That's called the gutter. So we really don't want that there, because it's hard to find what you're looking for. And just all of these things can kind of add up to make the reader experience just a little more difficult. Um, it doesn't take away from the content necessarily, but for some readers, it can make it hard to actually access the content the way you as a writer want it to be done. So um, I totally get it, though, because I am also an indie publisher. All of my books to date have been published by myself, which meant that I had to teach myself a lot of those processes. I started back in 2008 was when I published my first book. And my work is certainly not perfect. It is still just me on the Asteria Books team. So I know how hard it is to juggle all of those things. Um, yeah, so one of the things that happens when we're doing indie publishing is that when it's just us that's acting as our own proofreader, our own copy editor, our own layout designer, all of that kind of stuff, it's just really easy to miss. Your brain just sort of skips over the errors that you've already made because it knows what's supposed to be there. So it reads what it thinks should be there, but that might not be what's actually on the page. So again, these things are minor, but they can totally impact a reader's experience. That's all. And that's really my only criticism of either of these books. It's just formatting stuff. Hey, George, I don't know if you watch this channel or if you even know who I am, but I'm a fan of your books. I like them. I like your work. I like what you're doing on YouTube. You're putting good stuff out there. And I just wanted to mention that I do have my own imprint, and I have a little bit of experience with some of these things that I just mentioned. So if you're seeing this video and you're like, oh, but I can't fix that stuff, if you are open to collaborating, I would love to be able to help you bring the second edition of these books out, just with some extra eyes on them that I was just mentioning. I'm volunteering my eyes. Feel free to get in touch with me through my website. There's a contact page, put the link right here. And it should be like right here. I don't know. My camera's doing weird things. Like here. Anyway, feel free to reach out to me if you'd like to collaborate on some of that stuff. I would love to help just give a little polish. Maybe polish is probably not the right word. I don't know. Just there's no pressure. It's not absolutely needed, but if you're into it, I'm into it. Okay, so moving on. My typical book review format kind of goes like this. I talk about the book's relevance to tradcraft. I talk about the book's accessibility to witchy readers of varying degrees of experience, to the extent that I'm able to address that. And then I share a few insights that I gained by reading the book and a few ideas from the book that I personally would like to explore further. So both of these books are written by a tradcrafter about traditional and folkloric craft, specifically with other tradcrafters in mind. It is the most relevant to my interests and to the work of this channel, right? So if you're not a trad crafter, though, if you don't identify as being sort of traditional or folkloric in your style of craft, there is still so much that is useful and potentially relevant to other forms of craft within these books. I found both of these books very, very accessible. But as I may have mentioned before, I might be what could be called an advanced practitioner, since I've been on this path for 30 mumble years. I feel like the Ineffable name is especially well suited to beginners since it's essentially a tradcrafter primer. Um, Barbarous words, on the other hand, might be better for folks with some experience already when it comes to things like laying a compass, conjuration, and doing some work. The charms and conjurations are pretty easy to follow, though, so it wouldn't be a bad book to cut your teeth on when you're ready to move from study and theory into practice and experimentation. All right. So that was parts 1 and 2 for both books, covered and done. For insights and inspirations, though, I'm going to talk about the books separately. So if you're wanting mainly to hear about Barbarous words, you can go ahead and jump to this timestamp because I'm going to start with the Ineffable name, which was the first of the 2 books that was written. So let's start with the insights and things that I sort of resonated with or found especially relevant or important to sort of bring up and mention. On page 20 to 22, in those couple of pages, George talks about old craft versus Wicca. And I really like that he acknowledges that these paths share some roots, y'all, and that he attempts to reconcile some of the absolutely unnecessary and unneeded enmity that has existed between tradcraft or old craft and Wicca. When I was coming up in the craft, I know I've mentioned this before, it was the early days of the internet because witchcraft keeps you young. Just teasing. Anyway, it was the early days of the internet. We were using things a lot of times like Yahoo groups for group messaging, and there was just some absolutely vitriolic flame wars that happened. At that time, you could have convinced me that Wiccans and traditional witches just simply did not mix well. I am less convinced of that now, being 30 mumble years on. And I've seen it work. I've seen people collaborate and be able to talk with each other respectfully and to be able to acknowledge the beauty and the grace and the like potency that is in each other's form of craft. And I am just really grateful that he spent a little bit of time talking about that because we don't need to be fighting with each other. Um, you may have noticed that I don't go in for Wicca bashing here on my channel, as has so often been popular. Like honestly, looking down noses at each other seems to be one of the things that both sides of this really fictitious debate seem to do. So I don't love an us versus them dichotomy pretty much anywhere, and I find it especially harmful when witches are engaging in it amongst themselves. Like there's plenty of outside forces already trying to tear us down. We can maybe bury the Athames not in each other's backs. That would be great. So I really like that he spent some time talking about that, just sort of in general terms. All right, so on page 51, there is a quote from Cecil Williamson that goes like this. Witches regard monkeys as being spirits in human form. So in the Southwest, it is no surprise to find monkey skulls stored away in witches' trunks and used in magic making. And I found that really very, very interesting. I was totally unaware of those ideas and practices where they concerned monkeys. Like that just has never been on my radar. I've never heard that before. So I thought that was really interesting. I have several animal skulls that I work with in my own practice. So I know how powerful skulls are in general. But I've tended to work with animals from my own region. I've tended to work with skulls of animals from my own bioregion when I've worked with skulls and bones. Um, or with human-shaped skulls made of various materials like paper mache, ceramic, glass, and various kinds of stones. I'm honestly pretty concerned about the ethical and humane handling of the beings whose skulls I have. So I'm not likely to ever go in search of a monkey skull or a human skull. I'm just not sure that I can fully trust the online purveyors of those types of relics. And the investment in those bones is really pricey on top of it. So um, between those two things combined, really, it is not worth it for me to take the risk. However, I am really interested in exploring a little bit of what that means and maybe working with that idea to see what kind of results I get. On page 52, George writes about the hearthstone as a magical tool, and I found his description really reminded me of my own tradition's oath stone. Although the stone that we use for oath making is the anvil, which can be a stone and it can be a metal. Usually, contemporarily, it's always a dense metal object. But historically, the first anvils were really tough, flat rocks that you could shape metal on. So I like it for that. And I really love the idea of working directly with the spirit of the home by using the hearthstone as sort of that oath making place and that place where you're doing some of that work. I really like the idea of making chalk markings on such a stone for spell work. And I could see that being applied to a couple of different types of stones. So I thought that was pretty cool. On page 52 as well, in this section, George is talking about a bunch of different tools that are common among British folk magicians and trad crafters, old crafters. And he talks about the hagstone and the godstone. And those are familiar stones to me. I'm very familiar, obviously, with, well, I don't, maybe it's not obvious, but I'm very familiar with the godstone, which is usually a phallic shaped stone. And a hagstone is a stone with a naturally occurring hole in it, usually, almost always, that's caused by water erosion on the stone. And so, but the way that George is writing about them is a way that I haven't seen other writers talking about them. So specifically, he talks about the phallic godstone being empowered by the sexual fluids of the men of a coven. And honestly, I'm kind of here for it. I was taught to use blood, saliva, and sexual fluids as part of the seining of tools by my own high priestess when I was being trained in the work. So I like this concept, but also don't touch a witch's stuff, my friends, for more than one reason, right? There's lots of reasons to keep your hands off of a witch's things. Even if you are another witch and have an understanding of magic, you probably should especially know, don't go touching things if you weren't invited to do so. They're very personal. You have been warned. I also really liked that George talks about using these stones in fertility and sex magic, and that he makes it explicitly clear that queer witches can use two godstones, for example, or two hagstones, or whatever combination. I'm guessing if you're in a polycule, you could use a different combination that more accurately represents um, the generative and ecstatic experiences and practices that happen within your own relationship model. I like that that exists here in his writing where he's talking about it and making it really clear as opposed to just sort of buying into some of the really heteronormative practices that still get written about almost exclusively in books and that are most of the examples that we see. There's still a gender binary that's happening at play with only having the two stones, but I mean, I think that also could be modified, and I would be curious. Feel free to drop a line in the comments down below if you work with a different stone that maybe represents non-binary but still sexual and fertile energy. Okay, so on page 70, George talks about the Sabbats, and I appreciated that he acknowledges the fact that Sabbats or festivals or holy days or whatever term we're using from them from one tradition to the next are somewhat variable from one group to the next. In fact, they're really highly variable among trad crafting groups. Not all trad crafters or old school witches celebrate the same 8 Sabbats that we see in Wicca. In fact, some groups don't celebrate Sabbats at all, and they don't necessarily use the term Esvits for lunar workings, but some do. And all of those approaches are valid. And I really like that George took the approach of saying, this is what I do. This is what I've seen done mostly. Here's some other experiences that I've seen. Whatever you're doing is legitimate and valid, and it works. Because that, again, has been another one of the clubs that we've used to hit each other with, is to go, oh, well, you're not really a traditional witch because you're working with those holidays. And it's just silly. It's a silly way for us to divide ourselves. So good job, George. On page 73, I also have a note that where George suggests that the reader could venture to a stone circle for the summer solstice. Oh, George, how I wish that were a real option on this side of the pond. And I know that probably you were thinking mostly about your readers there in the UK, where they might have access to such amazing things. But we here in the US, which is where I live, and not just in the US, but I'll talk about where I am. We have to place our own standing stones or stone circles to be able to have access to those types of things. But I'm going to say I've been really lucky to have visited some sanctuaries here in the Midwestern part of the United States where that's actually been done. In fact, my husband was involved in placing one set of the standing stones that I'm referencing, and it's powerful. Like it really is. It's powerful. Even newly set stones, there's something. There's something about them that at least speaks to the deep human mind, and I don't. And it might go well beyond that, right? There might be um, kind of a physical or energetic thing that's happening that we don't have science yet to show what's happening, but something's happening. So I'm hoping, actually, for those of you that have seen videos that I've done about Midian, which is in South Central Indiana, it's a sanctuary space where festivals and events happen, and there's a good amount of magical folk coming to those events. I would love to see us eventually build a stone circle of some kind at Midian because I miss having access to it. And I think that that would be a great way to honor that sacred space and to set aside it as sacred in a certain location. I'm not sure if I'm saying that well, but yeah, I'm into it. And then the last sort of insight or thing that I learned that I wanted to point out was from pages 77 through 99. So it's about 22 pages. It's a whole chapter in which George is writing about some of the deities that are often honored or worked with within tradcraft. And I found these reflections on Tubal Cain, Azazel, um, the Queen of Elfheim, the Devil, and Dame Fate to be very nicely done. So if you're looking for some good insight onto those figures, whether you see them as spirits or deities or archetypes, however it is that you see them, George has some good insights into them, and I would recommend this book just for those reflections, if nothing else. All right, so ideas that I'd like to explore further based on the Ineffable name. George mentions Rosaline Norton several times throughout the book. She was known as the Witch of King's Cross, and I know of her only sort of vaguely, like she's been mentioned to me before, and I think I've seen a couple of references to her poetry and to her art. But I would like to actually, and I plan on doing more research on her and talking about her in a future video. So I actually have several videos planned about historical, mythical, and modern witchy individuals. Um, so I'm adding her name to the list. We're going to be talking about her at some point coming up. On pages 47 through 48, George writes about using a bull roarer or a wind roarer, and mentions a video by Cassandra Latham. So I was actually taught to use a bull roarer in relation to another branch of witchery, or magical practice, sort of shamanistic practice that I engage in. But it's not a practice that I've worked with very much, despite actually having a bull roarer in my gear, like it's in the space where I'm normally filming, which I'm not filming there today, by the way, because this AI background that's behind me is very mild compared to the snow that we actually got here, and I can't get out to the building where I normally do my videos. So there will be no driving here for about a week because we are covered, just covered in snow. So yeah, I'd really like to experiment more with the bull roarer, and I'd really like to hear about your experiences with it in the comments if that's a tool that you've used. I've seen it referenced um, both for laying the compass and also for calling spirits specifically. I think actually Ian Chambers in his book, The Witch Compass, had written about using a bull roarer. I'd have to verify that, so don't quote me on it, but I think he does, in terms of conjuration of specific spirits. So let me know. Is this a tool that you're using? How are you using it? If you feel comfortable sharing that, curious minds want to know. I'm the curious mind. On page 69, George writes, shares the wart cunning charm of fairy hair, which is a charm that was written by George's cousin. And it's used to learn the magical properties of a plant in cases where the folklore just doesn't seem to suggest any. So, lots and lots of plants have been written about. Obviously, the folklore varies from culture to culture too, so that's something to consider and to be cognizant of. Um, but the charm itself looks really simple and effective, and I'm going to try it with one or more of the catalpa trees that are in my area because, frankly, catalpa is a tree that I have not seen a lot written about, but they're everywhere where I live, and they've been talking to me for a while, like yelling at me every spring. They go, I won't go into what they do, but they get my attention every year, and to the point where I didn't know what a catalpa tree was. I had the word in my lexicon, but I couldn't have placed it with a tree. And the first spring that I lived in Kentucky, I was driving on a certain stretch of road, and it was like all I could see were these specific trees. Every time I looked at a place that had greenery, it was that kind of tree. And it was like it was shouting in my ear, I'm a catalpa. I'm a catalpa. And I'm like, okay, I need to know what that means. So yeah, I think it's time for me to sit down and listen and to get to know the trees. And I'm going to be using this wart cunning charm of fairy hair to see um, what they say. And then on page one, ooh, what did I write there? Yeah. All right. And then closer to the end of the book on page 171, George recommends several primary sources to check out for folkloric charms and inspiration. So these are books that George is recommending that you check out, and I'm making that recommendation too. And those books include The Magus, Le Petit Albert, or Le Petit Albert, or The Little Albert. um, Carmina Gadelica and the Black Pullet, as well as the Discovery of Witchcraft. And real honestly, he's so right. I need to get copies of just a couple of those books from my library. Most of the rest I have. Okay, friends, look, I'm going to be really real here for a second, like I do. If there's a book that you really want to see me review and you want to purchase that book for me and send it to me, that is a compact I am totally willing to make. You gift me a book, I will 100% review it on this channel. Yep, that's a deal. So that wraps up my thoughts on the Ineffable name. Let's move on to Barbarous Words. And I'm going to start by saying that Barbarous Words is a grimoire in true folkloric style. It's a handbook of spells and recipes for practically every occasion, most of which have been plucked and updated from the dim past for use by modern practitioners by George himself. So I absolutely love the grimoire tradition. So this book is honestly just a pure delight for me. And if you're into that, you should have this book. It needs to be on your shelf. Both Barbarous Words and The Ineffable Name feature some really wonderful original art by George's partner as well. Blair Duncan has done a lot of the art, almost all of the art, I think, for the interior, except for the pieces that are specifically pulled from the old grimoires, right? So circles of art and that kind of stuff. Those are sort of common that have been passed around a lot over the last few centuries, but the original artwork that's in there was all done by Blair Duncan, and it's really good stuff. Um, Also, I have a note here that because of the nature of this grimoire, it makes it a little bit harder to be succinct about the insights and inspirations that I was gaining. There are about a dozen essays at the beginning of the book in which George muses on the nature of British folk magic, and then there's something like 125 individual spells, charms, and conjurations. Um, the book is absolutely jam-packed with very useful bits, but it makes it a little bit harder to talk about in quite that way without going through and actually sort of discussing each spell or each charm. And I don't want to do that. You don't need me to do that. You should get the book so you can look at them, but they're good. So some of the insights that I did have that I thought I would share about this, or reflections, I guess might be a better term, is that on page 15, George describes British folk magic as including certain popish elements due to the influence of Catholicism on British culture in the early modern era. And I'm cool with that from a historical standpoint. I'm cool with that in somebody else's practice. But I struggle just a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, to work with Christian elements in my own craft at times. I think there are places where there are some Christian elements that have worked their way in, maybe in my overall mythos. But um, but yeah, some of the others are just kind of challenging for me. My brain, it's almost like I trip on them. um, so I've considered myself pagan, which for me is a blend of animism, polytheism, and Luciferianism for about 30 mumble years. Um, that's a long time to be doing things a certain way. Um, my upbringing was very rooted in fundamentalist Christianity. I shared a little bit of that here, something I'll probably get into more as we move along, right? It'll keep coming up. I was raised specifically missionary Baptist, and largely in the South or Southwest, but sort of right on the border of where the South becomes the Southwest. um, I went to Baptist schools from about the ages of 5 to 12, and my mom and I, along with all of our extended family, were really, really active in our local church from about the time that I was 14 to 18, which was the years that I lived where my family is rooted. I'm an Army brat, so I've been all over the place. But those years I lived where the rest of my family lived, and it was very, very church heavy, very specifically missionary Baptist heavy. So for me, that boils down to a couple of realities, right? One is that I have some religious trauma that's like linked to Christianity, which makes me avoidant of a lot of elements of Christianity, except for sort of some of the more rebellious figures or themes that come up within the Bible. So, for instance, I really dig a lot of the stuff on fallen angels, and Revelations has been a section that has always held a lot of interest for me. And there are some figures there that I really resonate with and relate to. I mean, for heckin's sake, right? I help run the Babylon Rising festival. Obviously, she's prominent in that chapter or in that book of the Bible. Um, but also, too, the Christianity that I was raised in didn't include things like rosaries and elaborate prayers, saints, or any of the sort of symbolic pageantry that exists within Catholicism. Protestants, and especially like Baptists, ripped that out. They see it as very pagan. So my I can find those aspects to carry a certain mystical quality and to have a lot of depth and beauty to them. But I really only have experience with them via their neo-pagan counterparts, which harken back to older pagan practices. So it's like I just don't experience those in a Christian context. I have only ever experienced those in a pagan or neo-pagan context. um, but I'm really curious about your experience with that, because I know we all come from different upbringings and different backgrounds, and most of us were not raised within the craft or something that looks like the craft. A lot of us were raised more in this either the overculture of Christianity or specifically a branch of Christianity. So I'm curious about how those elements come up for you. Like, do you incorporate Christian prayers or the Psalms, or hymns or saints or any other elements into your own witchy practice? Let's talk about that in the comments because I'm very curious. And then another thing that really stood out for me within Barbarous Words was that George lists the grimoires that served as a reference or inspiration for this book, Barbarous Words. Um, and I just thought I'd list those here for you. The books that he's drawing inspiration from are the 4 books of occult philosophy, The Discovery of Witchcraft, The Magus, The Grimoire of Arthur Gauntlet, Carmina Gadelica, Cambridge Book of Magic, The Black Dragon, Witchcraft Detected, and Egyptian Secrets, or Black and White Art for Man and Beast. That's a good list of grimoires, folks. So if you're interested in adding to your own grimoire library, those are some good ones to add. But also, if you're interested in sort of modern adaptations, like living adaptations of these older conjurations and charms, then Barbarous Words is going to be right up your alley. So things that I would like to explore further based on Barbarous Words. There's 2 in particular, and they're more projecty. So I have to be careful about that because I tend to add a lot of projects that I can't always fulfill because I have just a lot going on. But I kind of want to create my own collection of folk charms now that would be based on my own region. So George was writing about British folk charms, and I'd kind of like to write about Ozark and Appalachian folk charms. I know Brandon Weston has done a lot of that already, and I have a couple of his books that I plan on reviewing soon here on the channel. But I'm interested in continuing to collect those and to contribute to that body of work. I personally live in the foothills of Appalachia right now, and my family is from the Ozarks, and have been there for several generations. actually came from Appalachia to the Ozarks, which is kind of the story of how that happened for most people too. Most families in the Ozarks kind of started in mountains east of there and then moved west and found some more mountains and stayed there. So, and I would probably also get into some of the grimoire magic that I've worked a lot with and resonated a lot with, things like the PGM or the Greek magical papyri, papyrus, plural papyruses, the PGM, um, the Picatrix, Black Pullet, and other texts that honestly have influenced my own practice a lot. There's more on that list, but I'm interested in doing that. But I don't necessarily want to waste my time if that's something, well, it wouldn't be a waste of time. Not necessarily an investment of time that I want to make right now unless there's a lot of interest in that. So let me know in the comments if a work like that sounds like something that you would want to add to your own collection. And really, like, contact me through my website. I've got a submission form on there. If you'd like to contribute your own charms or conjurations to a project like that, because I also think that that could be a really cool collaborative project that, you know, a couple of us could head up, but lots and lots of people could contribute to. I think that could be valuable and interesting. um, so, yeah, let me know. And then another thing, another sort of project that this book brought up for me and made me want to do is that I think it'd be really cool to have a magical workshop and experimentation group. I know that some of those exist already out there. There's lots that are like, for instance, I have a friend named Taylor Elwood. You might know Taylor's books. Taylor works more from a sort of chaos magic into ceremonial magic method, but he's big on magical experimentation and has like a Facebook group that's based on that. And there's lots of practitioners in there contributing their ideas and thoughts and work. But I'm not really coming from a chaos magic perspective necessarily. I'm coming from this sort of modern folk magic perspective. And I think it'd be cool to be in a space with other modern folk magicians. Again, I'm sure that there's probably already something out there like that. I'm looking for something free. And not because I'm not willing to pay, but because I really feel firmly about the need for community spaces and resources that are not always behind a paywall. So if you know of something that's not behind a paywall like that, drop a link in the comments and I will 100% check it out and potentially join it because it is an interest. And if there's not something and you're interested in maybe helping roll up your sleeves and doing the work of making such a community exist, I would be down for helping to create a Discord channel around that. I just know that I don't have the time to keep maintaining it and supporting it. So I would need some people on a team to do that because of the aforementioned lack of copious amounts of free time that I have happening. But I think it should exist. I would like to see it exist, and I would be down for helping to make it exist as long as it's not on my plate to make it continue happening. Holy smokes, I think that's all that I have to say about it, about those two books, but that was quite a lot, I think. That was a lot of reviewing that we did. They were really good books, and I've really enjoyed reading them. I highly recommend them. If you are a contemporary trad crafter, you probably need these books on your shelf, and you're probably going to appreciate that you've got these books because um, one of the things that we saw in the 90s and early 2000s was that Capel Band, for instance, was putting out lots and lots of great books, and then they closed shop because that was a project that was just being run by a couple in the UK, and one of them passed and the other one retired, and the books are just not accessible, and they're worth hundreds and hundreds of dollars for each title now. So the fact that most trad craft authors are publishing in this indie context right now means that our work is a little bit less guaranteed to still be on shelves or still be accessible through something like Amazon after we retire, after we pass, or after we just kind of go in different directions the way people do. So buy up what Marshall is putting out, The Witch of Southern Light. Buy those books now because you might not find them in 5 or 10 years. Buy Jasmine Ambrosia's books now. Who knows what format she might go to in the future? She's probably going to get picked up by a publisher at some point. So you want to have that stuff. These early works are valuable, not just in terms of their monetary worth eventually, but also just in the ideas that are there. A lot of us are writing in really pure forms right now because we're not being censored by editors. We don't have publishers telling us we can't say things. So we're saying the things. Um, yeah, and my books count there too. um, I'm really, really looking forward to hearing your own experiences or thoughts on these two books down in the comments. If you've read them, feel free to share what you got out of them or what resonated with you, what you're looking forward to exploring. And as always, if you found today's video useful, thought-provoking, or inspiring, please, please bless me with the magic of the like button and the share button. Those things feed the spirit of the algorithm. So, yeah. Tell your witchy friends that good stuff, good magical stuff is happening over here at Blade and Broom. And I'll see you guys back here next week to talk about some more witchy goodness. Bye, friends.